Hi, Jeff Marshall with Key Learning Reflection number 2, titled Assistive Improvement. Fundamental issue I think we've got is we've identified a theory, we've identified components, but we haven't built a system. It kind of violates something we talked about very early in the course in Dr. Akoff's wonderful video that talked about a system, and that quality improvements often fail because they're not rooted in the systems. Now he's speaking primarily about operational systems that we're trying to improve, but I think his comments are equally valid when we're looking at the system improvement and how we're actually making those improvements. He gives a wonderful example of taking the best of breed car engine, car driver train, and other components of a car and putting them on a floor, but that doesn't make a car. The parts are interdependent and can't be a car in and amongst themselves. They've got to fit together in order to achieve the output that the car achieves. Now we actually started, I think, on a strong foundation with this model of improvement. The 5 major bubbles around here are those building blocks I think we need for a successful system of improvement. As we executed through the course, we understood the problem. We brought in the concept of fishbone diagrams to talk about root causes and potential ways to address the root causes. We moved into generating ideas for change with driver diagrams and talked about effective end statements, aim statements, primary and secondary drivers and change ideas, and that each driver needs to have a change idea. And you see here we're even talking about PDSA statements that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. We brought in the concept of a system of measures, of looking at the aim statement. What are the leading and lagging indicators for the aim statement, the driver measures, the process measures that really help us understand what we're going to do in those PDSA cycles, and the balancing measures that allow us to look across the system and making sure that we're not breaking something while we're trying to fix the one issue under concern. Then we moved into the test and build with the PDSA cycles, the Plan, Do, Study, Act, starting with a very restricted scale and scope, and then gradually broadening that scale and scope as we learn more. Each PDSA cycle builds on the other. The danger we've got here, though, is we're talking about starting with a plan, and plans actually are rooted in an understanding of the problem and the environment in which the problem lies. If you just start with PDSA, it's kind of like starting a race without knowing where the finish line is. Then we move into, as we're getting ready to execute, and looking at spread and scale, making sure that we understand the systems that are out there in the institution and the issues that we have for implementation, and as we're pushing it across the organization, understanding the context for all of that. Good components. We can take those components and we can build a system. I think we need to start with the one circle that we really didn't discuss too much in the course, and that's focus on collective efforts. It's more than just talking about how we have people working in each of these individual system components. It's also how do we build the project charter? Who's chartering it? What does the charter entail? How does the charter define success? And going back to finish line, I'm often reminded of the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland, where if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We need to know where we're going. We need to select the right road. We need to know where we've been, where we are, and where we're going to, and that all revolves around that notion of key success factors. We've then got to identify and understand who those stakeholders are, because the stakeholders are going to provide the constraints and limitations that are placed upon how we can do the project, as well as the resources in terms of both people and funding and systems. Stakeholders can be internal and external. There could be external stakeholders that are driving root causes on that fishbone that we can't address because they're external stakeholders, and we may have to go back to the chartering body and have them address it. We've got to understand how we take the output from one component and bring it into the input of another component in all of the three major phases of the system. And we've got to be able to govern the system. We've got to be able to articulate those key success factors. We've got to talk about measures of performance. Are we doing things right? As well as measures of effectiveness. Are we doing the right thing? So if you go back to the measures that we talked about earlier, the measures of performance are really down at the change level, and the measures of effectiveness are up at the aim statement level where we're looking at outcomes. We've got to make proper decisions. We've got to have governance processes that show how we flow through the whole system and then govern the actions that we take. So how do we move to this system of improvement? We've got to understand who charters the project, to lay out the scope, scale, responsibilities, and the concept, the success factors. Who are the stakeholders and how do they function within the system? What influences and constraints, especially do external stakeholders lay on the system that we may have to have the chartering body address? How do we identify the fishbone diagram problem statement? Hopefully that's coming from the project charter. If it's not, we need to go back to the chartering agency. And then how do we transform that into the driver aim statement? We need to be able to take the final driver aim statement and be able to tie that clearly back into the project charter to make sure that we are solving the right problem. What parts of the fishbone translate the drivers and the driver? So we may identify 5 or 6 root causes and only use 3 of them in the driver diagram. Why? What's making those decisions to translate a driver and secondary drivers from the fishbone root causes into that driver? And we've got to document it. Everything in this has to be documented successfully. Or 2 years from now, we'll wind up moving into an audit or people asking why this flow works the way it does, and we won't be able to ask those questions. We've got to be able to govern and assess all the way through. Assessment's not just a point in time, it is a continuous assessment of are we happy with the root causes? Do we have the right drivers? Do we have the right changes? How do we iterate through the PDSA cycles? And then finally, before we implement, we've got to be able to verify success and then post-implementation, make sure that it was in fact a success. So key missing components I think we've got to consider are the project charter, the governance, and audit. These things are critical to the solution. They're actually the glue, I think, that ties all these components together. So I'd like to stop here and pick up again on the final key learning reflection. Thank you very much for your time and attention.